Sometimes what turns a hotel into a legend isn't the guests who arrive, but those who never leave. In 1892, in the heart of rural Pennsylvania, the Ravenscroft Hotel bore witness to silent decisions, human errors, and a night that should never have ended. Stay until the end, because every detail of this story was recorded so it would never be erased. Where are you listening to this story from? Are you alone in your room, or perhaps gathered with loved ones? Either way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because stories like the tragedy of the Ashford family deserve to be remembered, shared, and never forgotten. At the end of the 19th century, when electricity was still a luxury and the night concealed more secrets than answers, the Ravenscroft Hotel rose as a symbol of progress and prestige in rural Pennsylvania. Built in 1892 to welcome influential travelers, wealthy merchants, and respectable families, the hotel promised comfort, security, and discretion. Essential qualities in an era when reputations were worth more than gold. But behind its elegant walls, silent corridors, and perpetually closed doors, something began to slowly decay. Small decisions made in moments of greed, fear, and convenience went unnoticed, while rumors whispered among the staff were drowned out by clinking glasses and forced laughter in the main hall. Everything seemed in its proper place, until it was far too late. This is not merely the story of an old building, but the record of a chain of human choices that turned an ordinary night into a moment of horror. What happened at the Ravenscroft Hotel was not the result of an immediate supernatural force, but of human failures, complicit silence, and truths buried under the weight of time. And now, more than a century later, this sinister account finally comes to light. There are places that do not commit crimes. They merely create the perfect environment for ordinary people to do unforgivable things and then learn to live with them. In 1892, in rural Pennsylvania, there was a hotel that did not need prominent newspaper advertisements to be known. The Ravenscroft Hotel was recognized in a different way, through whispered recommendations, handwritten notes, and men who spoke softly and left no trace behind. It did not promise excessive luxury or entertainment. It promised something far rarer: absolute silence. Built along a secondary road, surrounded by tall pine trees and constantly shrouded in winter fog, the Ravenscroft seemed to watch those who approached. Its imposing Victorian architecture conveyed stability, yet there was something in the placement of its windows, the long corridors, and the heavy doors that made the building feel closed off from the world. Edmund Ravenscroft, its founder, understood human nature deeply. A former lawyer, he learned early on that people do not seek hotels merely to rest. Many come to solve problems that cannot be resolved at home, and such problems demand discretion. At the Ravenscroft, unnecessary questions were never asked. Staff were trained to listen without reacting, see without commenting, and forget quickly. Records were minimal. Conversations were never repeated. Whatever happened within those walls stayed there. On the afternoon of December 17th, 1892, a snowstorm began hours earlier than expected. The road became nearly impassable. Shortly before nightfall, a single carriage broke through the white curtain and stopped at the hotel's main entrance. The Ashford family had arrived. Charles Ashford was the first to step down. Tall, rigid in posture, the kind of man who seemed to always carry the weight of old decisions. Next came Eleanor Ashford, his sister, her expression closed, her eyes far too alert. Henry Whitmore, Charles's brother-in-law, avoided looking directly at anyone. Finally, Margaret Ashford, too young to be there, yet old enough to understand that this trip was anything but ordinary. They did not laugh. They did not comment on the scenery. They showed no relief at having arrived before the storm worsened. They simply went inside. Thomas Whitaker, the hotel's manager for nearly 10 years, observed everything from the reception desk. He had learned to recognize problematic guests before they ever spoke, and the Ashfords carried all the signs: rigid steps, forced silence, glances that turned away at the last second. "Good evening," Thomas said with practiced courtesy. "Welcome to the Ravenscroft Hotel," Charles replied with a slight nod. He signed the guest ledger with a hand that was far too firm. None of them mentioned how long they intended to stay. They were assigned rooms on the 3rd floor, 2 rooms at the very end of the corridor, isolated. That night dinner was served in the main hall. The fireplace cast irregular shadows along the dark wooden walls. Silver cutlery gleamed beneath the yellowed light. Everything seemed appropriate for a family gathering, if not for the suffocating tension at the table. The conversations were superficial, almost automatic. Comments about the cold, the road, the wine. But behind every word, something unspoken pressed to surface. "We need to settle this," Charles finally said, his voice low but firm. "We can't keep pretending." Eleanor slowly set her glass down. "Settle what, exactly?" she asked. "What you caused, or what all of us helped to hide?" The silence that followed was too heavy, even for the Ravenscroft. Henry cleared his throat, trying to intervene. "Perhaps we should wait until tomorrow." Charles shook his head. "Tomorrow, the road may open. And then everyone returns to their lives as if nothing ever happened." Margaret kept her eyes lowered. She knew. They all knew. That night was not an attempt at reconciliation, it was a reckoning. After dinner, the family went up to the 3rd floor. The corridor felt longer than before. The sound of their footsteps echoed strangely, as if the hotel deliberately amplified them. The doors closed. On the floor below, Thomas tried to convince himself that he would hear nothing. But shortly after 10 o'clock, something fell, a dull sound, then raised voices, indistinct words, but thick with anger. He remained motionless behind the counter. The Ravenscroft did not reward curiosity. At 11:47, a short scream cut through the silence. It was not loud, it was not prolonged, it was cut off. Thomas closed his eyes. Minutes later, hurried footsteps crossed the 3rd floor corridor. One door was locked. Another was opened with enough force to make the structure groan. No employee went upstairs. At midnight, the lobby clock struck 12. Each chime felt heavier than the last. On the 3rd floor, something had been decided, something irreversible. The Ravenscroft remained silent, as it always had. And that very night, without anyone officially noticing, the hotel ceased to be merely a place of passage and became a guardian of secrets that should never have been remembered. When a door closes within a family, it isn't always meant to protect what's inside. Sometimes it's to prevent someone from escaping. The 3rd floor of the Ravenscroft Hotel had never been an ordinary space. Even before that night, staff avoided staying there longer than necessary. The corridors were narrower, the windows smaller, and the silence felt heavier, as if the air itself had weight. For guests who demanded absolute privacy, it was the perfect place. For anyone else, it caused immediate unease. That was where the Ashfords gathered after dinner. The door to the main room closed with a dry click. Charles Ashford remained standing for a few seconds, as if mentally organizing everything he was about to say. The small fireplace partially lit the room, casting long shadows along the walls. Eleanor sat near the window, arms crossed. Henry leaned against the dresser, visibly tense. Margaret stood near the door, not by chance, but by instinct. "We're not here by accident," Charles began, "and all of you know that." Eleanor answered before anyone else could speak. "We're here because you lost control of the situation, and now you want the family to pay for it." Charles turned slowly toward his sister. "I kept this family intact for years. I did what had to be done." "No," she shot back. "You did what was convenient for you." The tone escalated quickly. Old accusations resurfaced, names were mentioned, documents referenced without ever being shown. The inheritance of the Ashford patriarch, who had died years earlier, had always been a minefield. Altered wills, questionable signatures, decisions made far from witnesses. Henry tried to intervene, but his voice sounded far too weak. He had as much to lose as anyone else in that room. Margaret watched in silence, her heart racing. She had been summoned to that meeting as a formality, the youngest heir, useful for validating decisions that had already been nearly finalized. But as the voices rose, she began to realize something deeply unsettling. There was no plan for reconciliation, only confrontation. "If this comes to light," Eleanor said firmly, "all of us will be dragged down, including you, Charles." Charles took a deep breath. "That's exactly why we need to end this here. Tonight." The silence that followed was deeply uncomfortable. Outside, the wind battered the windows, making the structure groan. The Ravenscroft seemed to listen. Henry cleared his throat. "What are you suggesting?" Charles didn't answer right away. He walked to the small table in the center of the room, placed his hands on it, and lowered his head for a moment. "I'm suggesting that some truths don't survive daylight," he finally said, "and that some people know too much to remain free." Eleanor rose abruptly. "You've lost your mind." "No," he replied. "I've gone too far to turn back now." That was when the argument stopped being merely verbal. Henry stepped forward, trying to prevent the situation from escalating, but Charles shoved him with unexpected force. Henry slammed into the dresser, knocking a heavy object onto the floor. The sound echoed down the third-floor corridor, the very sound Thomas Whitaker would hear minutes later from below. "Stop!" Margaret screamed. But no one stopped. Eleanor lunged at her brother, accusing him of manipulating their father's will, of threatening former business partners, of buying silences that now cost far too much. Charles responded with even harsher words, revealing secrets Eleanor believed long buried. The argument turned physical within seconds. Charles shoved Eleanor backward. She stumbled and fell near the fireplace. Henry tried to grab Charles by the arm but slipped on the displaced rug. It was fast, confused, chaotic, the kind of moment no one can later reconstruct with precision. There was a scream, short, muffled, cut off. On the floor below, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. In the room, Margaret covered her mouth, frozen. Eleanor lay on the floor, eyes wide, her breathing irregular. Charles stepped back, his face pale. Henry stood motionless, trying to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to happen," Charles murmured. Eleanor tried to speak, but no sound came out. The impact had been far more severe than anyone had anticipated. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Charles made a decision. "No one leaves this room," he said, his voice low, far too controlled for that moment. "Not now." Henry stared at him in horror. "Charles, we need to call for help." "And explain what?" Charles replied. "That we came to the Ravenscroft to settle a family dispute and ended up killing someone?" The word hung in the air. Killing. Margaret began to cry. "This will destroy us." "Only if someone talks," Charles interrupted. True to its reputation, the Ravenscroft remained silent. They moved Eleanor onto the bed. They tried to clean her, to rearrange the room, as if they could reorganize reality itself. Charles went to the door and checked the corridor. No sounds, no staff. "The hotel doesn't ask questions," he said almost to himself. "It never has." Hours passed in a blur. When dawn approached, Eleanor was no longer breathing. The next decision was made with the same cold resolve that had defined the entire night. Charles left the room alone. He walked through the dark corridor toward the service stairs. His steps were hurried but controlled. Years later, a former employee would swear he had seen a shadow crossing the third floor at that very hour. By morning, only 3 members of the Ashford family came down for breakfast. Charles was not among them. When Thomas asked with practiced care whether Mr. Ashford would like his coffee brought to his room, Henry answered without hesitation, "He left before dawn. Urgent matters." Thomas noted it mentally. Nothing in the guest ledger recorded an early departure. No carriage had been prepared, but the Ravenscroft did not demand coherence, only silence. On the third floor, one door remained closed, and behind it, a family promise had been broken in a way that could never be undone. Old buildings are not haunted by ghosts. They are haunted by human decisions that were never confronted. When Thomas Whittaker left the Ravenscroft Hotel, he carried with him only a small suitcase and a weight that fit into no luggage. The winter of that year felt longer than any other, as if the season itself refused to leave. The snowfall eased. The road became passable again, but the hotel never recovered the normality it had once pretended to have. In the months that followed, new guests arrived, businessmen, traveling couples, solitary travelers seeking shelter. None of them knew the name Ashford. None of them had heard the scream. And yet, many departed with the unsettling feeling that they had taken part in something they could not understand. The Ravenscroft continued to offer silence, but now that silence demanded something in return. The first reports emerged timidly, almost apologetically. A woman claimed to have awakened in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone was arguing in the corridor. A merchant swore he had heard footsteps approaching his door, stopping just outside for long minutes. When he opened it, there was no one there. Always on the third floor. The new owners, the Caldwell family, dismissed it all as exaggeration. The building was old. The wood creaked. The wind slipped through invisible cracks. Nothing renovations couldn't fix. They replaced carpets, reinforced doors, repainted walls. Yet curiously, the room at the end of the corridor remained locked. "There's no reason to touch that one," Mr. Caldwell said once. "No one likes that room anyway." The problem was that the hotel seemed to like it. Employees began avoiding the third floor, not out of declared fear, but because of a persistent sense of discomfort. The air felt colder there, even with the heating on. Light bulbs burned out with abnormal frequency. Some doors closed on their own, with a dry click that echoed down the corridor. A housekeeper named Ruth was the first to formally refuse to work on that floor. She claimed that whenever she approached the locked room, she felt nauseous and experienced an intense pressure in her head, as if someone were screaming without sound. "It's like the place is trying to remind me of something," she said, crying to her supervisor. "Something I never lived." Ruth was transferred. Others replaced her. The pattern repeated. Over time, the Ravenscroft began to develop a strange reputation. Not officially, newspapers never reported anything concrete, but in whispered remarks, in cautious recommendations. "It's a beautiful hotel, but..." There was always a but. Some guests dreamed of a family gathered in a small room, raised voices, accusations. They woke with racing hearts, unable to explain why. Others claimed to hear something being dragged in the middle of the night. A particularly sensitive guest described a sudden metallic smell with no apparent source. The hotel was not creating ghosts. It was replaying memories. One night, a young writer stayed at the Ravenscroft on a recommendation from an acquaintance. He sought isolation to finish a manuscript and requested a room on the third floor, drawn by the promise of absolute silence. He was given a room far down the corridor, not the locked one, but close enough to feel its presence. On the third night, he awoke drenched in sweat, convinced he had heard his own name whispered. He swore he saw the doorknob slowly turning. The next morning, pale and shaken, he checked out and left without explanation. Later, he would write in his diary that the hotel felt like a mind that couldn't forget. The Caldwells began to worry. Occupancy rates dropped. Employees resigned. The third floor became both a logistical and financial problem. That was when they decided to investigate the hotel's past. They hired a local historian to search old records, deeds, guest ledgers, administrative documents. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The name Ashford appeared in the guest book, accompanied by dates far too short for a planned stay. No note of early departures, no mention of incidents. It was as if the hotel had swallowed the entire event. The historian suggested that something important might be missing. "Places like this," he said, "don't hide things by accident. Someone chose what was meant to remain invisible." Meanwhile, the third floor continued to function in its own way. Employees reported muffled arguments after midnight, not clear words but unmistakable tones, anger, fear, desperation. One night the reception bell rang on its own, as if someone were asking for help. When they went to check, no one was there. The locked room began to show strange signs. The lock jammed without reason. Dust accumulated unevenly, as if the air moved inside. One employee swore he heard something fall within the room, despite it having been empty for years. The decision was made. The room would be opened. On a grey morning, Mr. Caldwell, accompanied by 2 employees, unlocked the door. The creak echoed down the corridor like an ancient protest. At first glance, the room appeared ordinary. Furniture intact, bed neatly made. No obvious signs of abandonment. But the air was heavy. As he walked through the room, Caldwell felt a discomfort he couldn't explain. It wasn't direct fear, it was a sense of intrusion, as if he were entering something that did not belong to him. Behind the fireplace, they found old marks on the floorboards. Nearly imperceptible, but still there. When the rug was removed, it revealed a darker shade of wood beneath. "Paint everything," Caldwell ordered. "I want this resolved." But some things cannot be resolved with paint. After the room was opened, the reports worsened. Sounds became more frequent. Guests woke up screaming. One employee claimed to have seen a woman standing at the end of the corridor, motionless with her back turned, who vanished when he blinked. The Ravenscroft was changing, not like a decaying building, but like something that remembered too much. The Caldwells sold the hotel a few years later. The new owner attempted to turn the Ravenscroft into a historical attraction, offering guided tours and vague stories about mysterious events. But he avoided mentioning the Ashford family, avoided mentioning deaths, avoided mentioning decisions, because deep down, the hotel did not want to be a spectacle, it wanted to be a witness. Over the decades, the Ravenscroft closed its doors multiple times. It reopened under new names, new promises. It always failed. The third floor remained problematic, always the same room, always the same silence, until finally the building was deemed structurally unsound, closed permanently, isolated. But places like that do not die when they are abandoned. They only wait. They wait for someone to find what was hidden. They wait for the silence to be broken in the right way. And somewhere within the Ravenscroft, that night of 1892 still echoed, not as a scream, but as a persistent memory, endlessly repeated by walls that never learned how to forget. Some stories survive because someone tried to bury them too deeply. The Ravenscroft Hotel remained closed for nearly 20 years before anyone decided to walk through its doors again. Left to its own fate, the building began to deteriorate slowly. Broken windows, loose roof tiles, ivy climbing the walls like insistent fingers. To most people, it was just another old structure forgotten by time. But to a select few, the Ravenscroft had never ceased to exist. In the early 1920s, the building caught the attention of a young lawyer named Samuel Keller, hired by the local municipality to catalogue abandoned properties ahead of a possible expropriation. Keller had no interest in ghost stories. His work was technical, cold, objective. Yet the moment he stepped into the Ravenscroft's lobby, he felt something he couldn't explain. The silence inside was not an absence of sound. It was a presence. For days, Keller walked through the building with flashlights and clipboards, noting cracks, assessing structural risks, opening doors that hadn't been opened in years. Everything seemed predictable, until he found the former manager's office. The door was stuck. He forced it carefully until it gave way. Inside, he found furniture covered in sheets, papers scattered, forgotten files. Nothing unusual, until he noticed something strange on the wall behind the desk. A subtle unevenness, an imperfection that didn't match the rest. Driven by professional curiosity, or something more, Keller pressed against the wood. A false panel opened with difficulty, revealing a narrow space. Inside it, wrapped in thick yellowed cloth, was a notebook. Without knowing it, Samuel Keller had just found the heart of the Ravenscroft. The notebook belonged to Thomas Whitaker. Its pages were filled with firm but hurried handwriting, dates, times, meticulous descriptions of sounds, behaviors, sensations. As Keller read on, he realized this was not an ordinary diary. It was a record of something Thomas had never officially reported, something he had never been able to forget. The entries culminated on the night of December 17th, 1892. Thomas described the arrival of the Ashford family, the tense atmosphere, the noises on the third floor, the muffled scream. He recorded the unexplained absence of Eleanor Ashford the following morning. He mentioned stains in the room, hurried attempts at cleaning, decisions made in silence, but there was more. In the final pages, Thomas had written something no one had ever read. Eleanor Ashford died that night, not by accident, not by illness. She died because everyone chose silence, including me. A chill ran down Keller's spine. He spent days cross-referencing information. He consulted old records, death certificates, family archives. He discovered that Eleanor Ashford had officially been declared dead months later in another city due to respiratory complications. No body had been publicly displayed, no documented funeral. Charles Ashford had disappeared shortly after that night. Some said he emigrated, others claimed he died under unclear circumstances. No formal investigation had ever been opened, everything fit. The Ravenscroft had not been the stage of a supernatural mystery. It had been the setting of a perfectly buried crime. The municipality attempted to suppress the discovery, not out of malice, but convenience. Most of those involved were already dead. The hotel was a ruin. Reopening the case would expose former authorities, influential families, decisions that were never meant to be questioned. Keller was instructed to archive the notebook as material without legal relevance, but he couldn't. Before handing it over, he made copies. He kept one for himself. And it was that copy that, decades later, would allow the story to come to light. The Ravenscroft was officially condemned and partially demolished. Only part of the structure remained standing, deemed too unstable for use. The area was sealed off. The site disappeared from tourist maps. But the impact of the discovery did not vanish. Long-time residents began to speak. Stories that had once been mere rumors took shape. A former employee revealed he had helped clean the room that dawn. A housekeeper confessed she had heard Eleanor asking for help behind the door and chose not to respond. The weight of silence spread. Curiously, after the notebook was removed, the strange reports nearly ceased altogether. No new guests, no staff, no shared dreams. As if the Ravenscroft had fulfilled its purpose. It had preserved the memory, and now it had returned it to the world. Today, what remains of the Ravenscroft Hotel is little more than time-worn walls. But those who pass along the secondary road on quiet nights still report a strange sensation when they look at the site. Not fear, not curiosity, guilt. Because the true haunting was never Eleanor Ashford. It was never a spirit bound to the corridor. It was the collective choice not to act. It was convenience disguised as prudence. It was silence treated as virtue. The Ravenscroft did not create monsters. It simply offered the ideal environment for ordinary people to become accomplices. And perhaps that is why this story still echoes. Because on some level, everyone recognizes that hotel. Everyone knows a Ravenscroft, a place, physical or moral, where something wrong happens, and no one says a word. And now that you know this account, the inevitable question remains. If you had been there that night, would you have opened the door?